next on Secrets of War. They were unlikely heroes who fought behind enemy lines in every theater of World War II. Often using little more than their bravery and cunning, female spies unearthed secrets, supported the resistance, and destroyed the morale of the enemy. Many of them paid the ultimate price. Women spies are next on Secrets of War.
August 1944, somewhere in eastern France. This woman is about to embark on a clandestine mission behind German lines. She's a member of the French resistance, working as an agent for the secret intelligence branch of America's newly formed Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Her codename is Lillian. She hopes to free another valuable woman agent from a Nazi prison camp. Hidden in her shoulder pads are 70,000 gold francs that she will use to bribe the enemy guards. A Signal Corps camera captures the final preparation for her mission. An OSS agent checks her forged identity papers and her personal effects are examined to be sure there's no trace of her connection to the Allies. Several agents have been shot for carrying American cigarettes. Lillian is not what we've come to expect in a female spy. She's no femme fatale, plotting to uncover secrets by seducing an ambassador at an embassy party. Her mission relies on her intelligence, cunning, and courage. And if she fails, she risks torture or execution. She represents the thousands of women who played a vital role in all phases of espionage during World War II.
Well, they often say that espionage is the second oldest profession. The oldest profession has often been a way of getting intelligence. The men were the people with the secrets, and the way to get the secrets from the men was sexual favors.
In World War II, we saw a transition. Not only were women used for sexual purposes, which they clearly were, but they were effectively used as couriers, and they supported the intelligence services, be it from filing positions or serving as chauffeurs to jobs such as radio operators and manning radio receivers. The war effort in the clandestine war would not have been as successful without the contributions of women.
4 weeks after setting out, Lillian returned with the other female agent. The woman had broken ribs, courtesy of a Gestapo interrogation, and both agents had raw and infected knees from crawling on ice. Not only had Lillian rescued the other agent, but she delivered valuable intelligence about German troop strength and position. Their mission was a complete success. There are references to women spies in virtually every conflict in recorded history, typically in the seductress role.
In the American Civil War, Rose O'Neal Greenhow, the famous Confederate spy who was in Washington, D.C., said, "God gave me both a mind and a body, and I shall use them both in the defense of the Confederacy."
By World War I, women began to take on a broader role in intelligence gathering.
Networks began to develop and were encouraged to develop by British and French intelligence in the First World War, whereby women form a useful service being an observer. There's not going to be anything terribly suspicious about a farmer's wife sitting outside the farm at the crossroads shelling peas. But if she's actually counting the number of guns that she sees going by, and she's putting the one pea from one bowl into another, this is the sort of job that she can fulfill.
World War I also introduced the name that has become synonymous with the seductress spy, Mata Hari. But like many of history's tales of women agents, hers is a story filled with myth and misconception. Before the war, Margaretha Zella was a Dutch housewife, unhappy and bored. She moved to Paris and became a successful exotic dancer and prostitute. With the outbreak of war, both the Germans and the French recruited her as a spy, hoping she could gather information through her many love affairs. She made some clumsy attempts at intelligence gathering, but today historians agree that any espionage work she carried out was of little significance. Eventually, she was betrayed by the Germans and used as a scapegoat by the French.
Throughout, one gets the feeling that she's frighteningly naive, that she's dabbling in intelligence without any knowledge of either the stakes or even what she's doing. She's sentenced to death. She's executed by a firing squad. A fascinating woman in so many ways, but certainly not a spy. In no way was Mata Hari a real spy.
World War II brought a new generation of women agents, seriously trained for intelligence work. But undeniably, the tradition of the seductress still continued. Amy Elizabeth Thorpe, known by her code name Cynthia, was born in Minneapolis in 1910. She married a British diplomat, Arthur Pack, who gave her an entree into aristocratic circles and access to valuable intelligence. Cynthia was also a beautiful woman, willing to use her charms to carry out her missions. She once said, "I hope and believe I'm a patriot. I was able to make certain men fall in love with me, or think they had at any rate, and in exchange for my love, they gave me information." While living in Warsaw, Poland in 1938, her marriage was failing, and she yearned for adventure. As the threat of war approached, she was recruited by the British Secret Intelligence Service. She seduced the assistant of the Polish Foreign Minister, Joseph Beck, and gained an inside view of the workings of the office.
The intelligence that she was gathering in Poland was fairly low grade. It's if you have a friend in a ministry who maybe at the very least can tell you whether the head of that ministry is popular, what sort of problems they've got, when there's a flap on. These are the general sort of things that can be picked up. Furthermore, there may even be a way of, if you can find out who's got a drink problem or who's got money problems, that is in its own way can be just as important as finding a spare copy of a letter.
By 1941, she'd moved to the United States, and her work came under the Office of the British Security Coordination, operating from New York City. She was assigned missions of greater complexity and importance.
When she was asked to approach the Italian naval attaché, there was a very specific intent to secure the Italian naval codes. This certainly does move her into another area. This is not just general chit-chat.
Cynthia invited Italian Admiral Alberto Lais to her Georgetown apartment and began an affair. They would meet at her place 2 or 3 times a week. She eventually convinced him to turn over the Italian naval codes, claiming it was for her still neutral American friends. During the upcoming sea battles in the Mediterranean, it was noted how easily the British gained the upper hand against the superior numbers of the Italians. Then in 1942, Cynthia undertook a far more dangerous mission. Working with the OSS, she was assigned to liberate code books from the safe of the Vichy French embassy in Washington. She began a liaison with a French diplomat named Charles Bruce. He quickly fell in love with her, and she convinced him to become an accomplice in the mission. The plan called for the lovers to act as decoys to allow access for an OSS safecracker. For many nights, they visited the embassy, making certain the guards were aware of their illicit affair. They could often be found caressing one another on a couch in a room adjoining the one which held the codes. On the evening of the 21st of June, 1942, Cynthia and Charles entered the embassy and undressed on the sofa, providing cover for the safecracker. But then an embassy guard entered the room, threatening the operation. Thinking quickly, Cynthia stood naked in the beam of his flashlight. Shocked and embarrassed, the guard apologized and fled. Soon the safe was opened and the cipher books were rushed to a makeshift photo studio at a nearby hotel. By morning, the codes were returned to the safe, leaving a copy in Allied hands. After the war, Cynthia was asked if she was ashamed of her amorous activities. She replied, "Ashamed? Not in the least. My superiors told me that the results of my work saved thousands of British and American lives. Even one would have made it worthwhile. Wars are not won by respectable methods." The 10th of May, 1940. The Battle of France had begun. The Nazi blitzkrieg completely overwhelmed the Allied defenses. Towns were devastated by the German bombs. Families were sent fleeing from their homes under the merciless charge of the Nazis. In just 4 days, Holland fell. By June 14th, Hitler's troops were marching into Paris. Citizens were terrified by the memories of the brutal German occupation during World War I and crushed by the devastating reality that their country had been taken over by the Nazi onslaught. More than 90,000 Frenchmen were dead, and the nation was left stunned, demoralized, and leaderless.
France is very proud of its military, and we were ashamed to have to sign the armistice. And people were crying in the street. It's not especially from the fear, but for the shame of being occupied.
For us, French people, for me as an officer, for my colleagues, this was a lifetime drama to have seen the defeat, a whole country's disaster. And that's not all. Millions of people with their horses, their bikes, their animals, their mattresses, flowing more and more into southern France was the most terrible thing.
Enemies of the Nazis were executed, and citizens were placed on near-starvation diets. Oppressive policies were devised to further humiliate and demoralize the people and destroy their will to fight back.
Well, they were doing in every way, and then sometimes even to the point of being silly. For instance, in the south of France, it's very hot during the summer, and the women like to wear shorts. And they had made a law that the short had to be a certain length, just 2 inches below the knee, and if it was a quarter of an inch further down or up, you were arrested.
The military hierarchy was completely panic-stricken. They didn't know what to do. They tried to find responsible leaders. They tried to see what they wanted to do in this defeat. So what are we doing? What are we doing? Can you imagine all these people asking me, what are we doing? Well, so we decided to organize secret resistance.
On the 18th of June, Charles de Gaulle, in exile in Great Britain, stood at a microphone at the BBC studios in London. He exhorted his countrymen to join him and work towards their own liberation, and never let the flame of French resistance be extinguished.
The speech and the tone of voice he had when he gave the speech just incited the spirit, and I thought I have to do something when I heard that.
Hélène Deschamps' father was a French officer. She was proud of her military heritage. She sought out a resistance leader and volunteered. She was just 17 years old.
My dear, he said, I think you better go back to school. And I said, well, I want to do something. I don't want to live under the occupation and do what the enemy order. And he said, well, why don't you apply with the Red Cross, and this will be perfect work for you. I said, it's not what I have in mind. I said, I want to fight.
After much convincing, Hélène was accepted as the first woman in her resistance group. But eventually, she became one of thousands of courageous women who called on far more than feminine charms to carry out their dangerous missions.
At the beginning, I was just a courier. I was bringing envelope to one town to another and just give to somebody, talk to me and give me a name which was not his, and I give mine which was not mine. And this was the very beginning of the underground. Sometimes what we would do when we know a German group will come by with cars and so on, trucks, we would throw all kind of nails on the road, just think childish in a way, but it relieved us a little bit of this hatred that was building inside.
Secrecy was key to resistance operations. Hélène could not even tell her mother of her activities and explain her long absences from home.
Mother never knew what I was doing. She thought I was having a wonderful time partying. And she never knew what I did until the end of the war.
Hélène learned the trade well, taking on more and more responsibility. She carried out reconnaissance missions and led downed flyers on the escape routes out of France into neutral countries. Then in 1943, her role changed dramatically. She was assigned to serious intelligence gathering. She became an undercover agent, a spy. Before the war, she knew a man who became a leader in the milice, the French version of the Gestapo. She was told to move from her home in the south of France to the new French capital in Vichy. There she was to gain the confidence of her acquaintance and infiltrate the milice headquarters. She convinced the milice chief to hire her as his personal secretary. In his office were the files of the Frenchmen who'd been denounced as traitors by their own countrymen.
He had the files like this, and every morning he will come to the files and he will tell his lieutenant, now which letter of the alphabet shall we choose today? And then the other one will say, how about the N? Oh, good idea. So he will open the drawer and he will take a bunch. He didn't even look. And those people were killed or sent to concentration camp or arrested or whatever. So every morning when I came early, you know, I would go to the drawer, and me too. Without looking, I would take some name and put it in my bra, and then go to the bathroom with comb and lipstick, and then I would tear the papers. There would be that many people saved.
For 7 months, Hélène worked in milice headquarters, gaining valuable intelligence about milice raids on resistance networks and stealing official stamps and letterhead for creating forged identity papers. Eventually, the milice grew suspicious of Hélène. She was interrogated and beaten, but her cover was never blown, and she returned to her resistance group in the south. By then, her sister Jackie suspected Hélène was a resistance fighter. She convinced Hélène to allow her to join the effort. The two girls took advantage of their age and innocence to gather intelligence.
Me and my sister, sometimes we did flirt a little bit, but Mainly we look so innocent and so young, and for instance, many times we would go near an airport, and then we would go on the bicycle, and then my sister would look like she fell off the bike. So the German would call and come and look, and she would fall and cry, and I would say, can you help her? Meanwhile, I was counting the planes, you know.
By the fall of 1943, Helene and Jackie were repelled by the rivalries between factions within the resistance. So they volunteered to work with OSS. In support of the Allied invasion, the OSS was sending agents to France to help train and equip the resistance against the Germans. Helene and Jackie operated behind the lines, tracking the movements of troops and equipment and reporting their findings to a radio operator. Helene had now been in the resistance for 4 long years. She'd become a hardened agent.
You know, when you were in the underground, an agent had to give up everything. You couldn't keep friends, you had no friends, you had to forget your family, you had to forget the normal life. You had no life at all.
What had begun as almost a game had turned into a grim struggle, often with deadly consequences. She'd seen numerous associates tortured and executed by the Nazis. She and Jackie were almost executed by another resistance group who had mistaken them for German agents. And then the terrible news that Jackie's fiancé, an OSS leader named Petit-Jean, had been killed by a sniper bullet through the heart. But like any soldiers, Jackie and Helene had to pursue their mission. Just one day after receiving word of Petit-Jean's death, Helene, Jackie, and a driver were rushing by car to deliver intelligence to the Americans when they too were caught in sniper fire.
And then my sister said, I'm hit. You know, it was so sudden, and so I didn't even realize she was really hurt. And I put my hand on her head, you know, talked to her like a child and said, don't worry, darling. I said, pretty soon we'll come to a village and then we can take care of you, don't worry. And then the driver stopped the car and he said, well, let's stop here and get help. And so I turned around and I said, oh, Jackie, we can take care of you, and turned around and her eyes were open and I knew she was dead.
Like her fiancé, Jackie was shot through the heart. Helene could only take the time to get a bedsheet from a nearby farmhouse to bury her sister.
I wrapped my sister in it, and I dig a hole with the driver, and I bury her there. And the chief of the underground gave a little speech, you know. He said, Jacqueline, a young girl from France, you give your life, you give your courage, you give your love to your country. Thank you. And I went on and continued the mission.
Their orders came directly from Winston Churchill. Set Europe ablaze. These were agents of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, a secret organization established in the summer of 1940 to aid resistance groups in sabotage, terrorism, and subversion.
Churchill wanted commando raids, he wanted terrorists, saboteurs. He wanted no German to ever walk down the street without looking over his shoulder to see if there was a terrorist, a saboteur behind him. He wanted no German to drive across a bridge without fearing his life would end as a bomb went off under the bridge. So SOE was organized to turn German-occupied Europe into flames.
From their headquarters at 64 Baker Street in London, the SOE recruited agents who were to be sent into occupied territory, posing as natives. But in 1940, all the military services were competing for manpower. The SOE realized women might well have the qualifications for the mission.
Frequently, women, and especially women from affluent families, had traveled extensively in the period between World War I and World War II. So they were more common to speak foreign languages, and especially those languages that were desirable if they were now occupied countries, but they had traveled abroad and they were comfortable and understood the cultures and the mannerisms and how to travel.
SOE certainly broke new ground. It was the first government body to arm women and send women into theatres of operations. Now, this isn't to say that the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, hadn't been doing that on other occasions, but I think it could be argued that the organisation that did it for the first time and admitted it was SOE.
Women were recruited and then trained in the same rigorous programs as men.
Women agents were given a preliminary training to assess their capabilities, being watched all the time to see how they reacted, what their character was really like. If they passed that first stage, they could be sent up to Scotland, where they would be given a general toughening up process. Then, if they passed that, they would be brought back down to the real agent training school, where they would be given what we now call tradecraft training. They would be told about the sort of German security services they would be up against, how to form networks, how to avoid being followed, how to follow somebody without being caught yourself. And then if they pass that, they may then get sent on to a wireless training school where they will be taught how to work one of the suitcase radio sets.
One of the SOE's most adept radio operators was Yvonne Cormont. She'd volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force after her husband was killed by a German bomb during the London Blitz. After placing her young daughter in a convent for safety, Yvonne began her service. She was fluent in French and was soon recruited by the SOE's French unit, the F section.
I was willing to do whatever I could. This was something I think my husband would have liked to do. And as he was no longer there to do it, I thought it was time for me to do it.
Cormont remembers her training to be the same as the men's, almost.
The first training, they tried us out to see what kind of job we might respond to best. I was rather annoyed to discover men only were used as group leaders. There was real discrimination there, but women and men were taken in as radio operators, as couriers, and men only for sabotage. Well, that I was quite glad of. For me personally, it was the radio.
In August of 1943, she parachuted into France and joined the wheelwright resistance circuit. Her skills at operating the radio, or playing the piano as it was called, were legendary. She was not permitted near the location where an explosive was being set for fear of injury to her prized hands.
I'm very nervous, but patient. It's a funny mixture, really, and you need that for radio work. You need the patience to do the coding and the decoding. You need the resourcefulness of nervousness to be able to decide whether to go on if you think somebody's listening in, or to cut off and ask for another scare and that sort of thing. And I must admit to butterflies floating in my tummy all the time. You had to have your eyes in the back of your head as well as in front.
Radio communications were essential to the success of the secret operations. Resistance groups relied on coordination with Great Britain for delivery of their weapons and supplies. However, typically F-section radio operators only lasted about 6 weeks before being caught by the Nazis. So the agents soon learned the tricks to survival.
The ideal was to move around all the time so that you could never be spotted in any particular place. That's one thing. The other one was it was more secure to be in the city than in the country, because the idea would be an apartment building where if you were on the air for too long, you could be spotted to the building, but not necessarily to the apartment.
Yvonne never remained in one place for more than 3 days, and she found courageous support from the local population.
Those who offered me a roof and offered me food always knew that I'd come from England, that I was English, and had my set. They were asked before, would you take a radio operator, because that more than doubled the danger for them. And I'll give it to these people. Not once was I refused accommodation.
She also became a master of disguise, sometimes receiving invaluable advice from the French patriots. One day she was posing as a farmer's wife, looking after cows.
The farmer's wife had told me, don't wear a watch. No woman who looks after cows would be able to afford a watch.
Remarkably, Yvonne Cormeau remained undercover in France for 13 months, sending more than 400 messages. She was awarded the prestigious MBE, the Member of the British Empire, for her courage. When World War II began, America had no central intelligence gathering organization. So in 1942, President Roosevelt established the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. By the war's end, more than 21,000 people worked for the agency. Over 4,000 of them were women. Although few female agents were actually sent behind enemy lines, General William Donovan, the first director of the OSS, recognized their vital role. He said they were the ones at home who patiently filed secret reports, encoded and decoded messages, answered telephones, mailed checks, and kept records. There were some with regional and linguistic knowledge of great value in research, and whose special skills were employed in exact and painstaking work, such as map-making and cryptography. Donovan praised these women as the invisible apron strings of the organization. One of the few assigned to the field was Barbara Lauers-Podolsky. She'd fled from Czechoslovakia and had written a book about Czech airmen who gave their lives for the Allies in the Battle of Britain. Their bravery inspired her to join the U.S. Army and volunteer for field work.
The fate of all these airmen who perished got under my skin, and I felt that I could be useful with my knowledge of foreign languages in the U.S. Army rather than, let's say, pushing papers in Washington throughout the war.
Her mission in the OSS was known as morale operations, to upset the psychology of the enemy soldiers.
Morale operations is supposed to undermine the morale of the frontline soldier. And when the morale of the frontline soldier is upset, he's not going to perform too well, and the whole front line is going to crumble.
Barbara's top-secret group was skilled in languages and forgery. Their primary weapon was to covertly distribute subversive information behind enemy lines, material known as black propaganda.
White propaganda is clearly something that the enemy, in this case American, British, French, do and send across the lines. Black propaganda, however, pretends that it comes from inside Germany, inside Italy, inside Japan. And it has to be crude enough to be believable.
There were no rules in black propaganda. Their materials took many forms. Barbara's group once created a fictitious Lonely Hearts Club leaflet that convinced German soldiers that back at home, all women had now volunteered to sleep with any soldier who came home on leave.
The Lonely Hearts Club was invented by us, and we made a leaflet stressing that everybody is part of it. Your wife, your daughter, your mother, your sister. Well, when a frontline soldier learns that his wife is sleeping around with just about everybody, he's not going to be very happy about it. And his morale is going to be undermined.
The propaganda leaflet was so authentic that the Washington Post reported the club as actual activity being carried out in Germany. Barbara's unit also included noted cartoonist Saul Steinberg. Together, she and Steinberg created some other unusual propaganda materials.
There was also a leaflet that I cut in linoleum. It was actually a toilet paper. It was somewhat indecent, but the drawing was made by Steinberg. It showed a likeness of Hitler, and underneath there was advice: use this side.
Barbara was stationed in Rome, but she would often move to the front to interrogate surrendering soldiers the moment they crossed the lines. She would probe for any new tidbits of information that could be used by her team.
We had a bull session practically every evening about what could be done, what should be done, what might work, what is possible. You see, the success of morale operation was also the understanding we found at the headquarters. None of our ideas was ever rejected. Be it the cookiest, the headquarters always said, go ahead, try it.
One of the unit's most celebrated missions was known as Operation Sauerkraut. It was a plan created immediately after learning of the unsuccessful bomb attack on Hitler in 1944. They saw a golden opportunity to create havoc behind the lines. That night, Podolsky was dispatched to a POW camp to find German soldiers she could turn into spies for their operation.
I was looking for dissidents, people who were displeased with the regime in Germany, people who had reason to be unhappy about the war. And these were, for instance, a German who lived in Yugoslavia, was forced into the German army. And I made it clear to them that they could help by convincing the frontline soldier that there is revolution way back in Germany, that people are fed up with the Nazi regime.
16 operatives were chosen. They were given new identities, credentials, and uniforms, and were trained to maintain their cover.
We had to change their identities and drill into them new names, so that if they were awakened in the middle of the night and asked the maiden name of their mother, they would know the different name.
The agents then moved behind the lines, distributing leaflets and fake newspapers.
They would leave it at places where soldiers would gather, let's say a cafe, at a bus stop. They would pin it to the tire of a parked truck, and so on. And our agents reported that they have seen several soldiers reading it, and then one coming back and pocketing it to show to others. So it reached the target.
Despite running the risk of being shot as spies, none of the agents defected back to the German side. Besides carrying out their mission, they also brought back valuable intelligence information. The successful agents were rewarded after their mission.
We wanted them to feel relaxed and happy, and young men, when they have done a good job, all they want is what we used to call in the army horizontal engineering. So there was an apartment in Rome where these young men could invite female species. And I would be sitting in a jeep down on the street waiting until the operation was over. And then when the female species would come down, I would pay them. And sometimes I would fume and say, how on earth is our disbursing officer going to explain this expenditure to the American taxpayer?
Barbara was the only woman on her morale operations team. The OSS wasn't really set up to have women in its ranks. Although she was only a private, she was assigned a driver who was a captain. But often in her duties, Barbara had to assert herself with the same authority as her male counterparts.
Sometimes the people I interrogated resented the fact that I was a woman. I once even misbehaved and hit one prisoner because he was ornery. He vilified America. He called President Roosevelt names, and I couldn't restrain myself, being half Slovak. I hit him real hard. I gave him a knuckle sandwich.
One of Barbara's final operations proved to be one of the most successful. She directed her black propaganda at the numerous Czechoslovakian soldiers who were forced to serve as working troops for the Nazis.
The leaflet started with a recollection of Hitler's statement that not a single Czech will serve in the German army, and yet you are serving the Germans as their lackeys, and it is still time. Throw off that uniform of the German army, throw away the identity which was imposed upon you, and come across the lines, come and join your brothers who are fighting on the right side.
Due to Barbara's efforts, more than 600 Czech soldiers surrendered to the Allies. In 1944, Barbara Lauers-Podolsky received the Bronze Star for her mission. She was perhaps the most effective of all women agents in World War II. She was an operative for both the SOE and the OSS, and was decorated for heroism by both Great Britain and the United States. Her name was Virginia Hall, but to the French underground she was known as La Dame qui boite, the limping lady. Virginia Hall had only one leg.
Some agents are made and some are born. One certainly sees in Virginia Hall's career that she had a natural aptitude for the job.
Virginia was born to a wealthy Baltimore family in 1906. She attended Radcliffe and Barnard College and showed a flair for languages, becoming fluent in French, German, and Italian. She craved the excitement of living abroad and worked for the Foreign Service in Poland, Estonia, Italy, and Turkey. While stationed in Turkey, she shot herself in a hunting accident which led to the amputation of a leg below the knee. She nicknamed her false limb Cuthbert. When the war broke out, Virginia volunteered for the French ambulance service. But after the fall of France, she moved to London, where she was recruited by the SOE. Then in the summer of 1941, she became one of the first female agents sent into France. Her cover was as a foreign correspondent for the New York Post, writing articles about life in Vichy France. Meanwhile, she set up SOE operations from her Lyon apartment. Her work was incredibly effective and widespread.
It's often said to be very, very unwise for people engaged in secret activities to spread their nets out too far. So if you're intelligence gathering, you gather intelligence. Virginia Hall seemed to have been involved in just about everything going on in eastern France during that period, helping invaders, working on agent escape lines, sending couriers, receiving lost and homeless agents.
When Brian Stonehouse first parachuted into France, things were going badly. He was having difficulty establishing his networks, He sought out Virginia Hall for assistance.
I knew of her existence because I was told about her from London. We were said not to go near her unless it was a matter of life and death, because she was being watched by French police and I presume the Germans as well. But things got so complicated in Lyon that my courier, Christian, I went to see her and she was very helpful in getting it started and organized.
By the winter of 1941, the Nazis were on to Virginia and about to arrest her, but she escaped on foot over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain.
That would be a remarkable achievement for anyone, but this woman had a wooden leg. Understandably, by the time she got on the other side of the Pyrenees, the stump was bloodied. It was quite a mess. So not only did she have the business of escaping, it must have been a painful escape.
At one point, she radioed back to England and explained the painful condition of her leg.
She says, Cuthbert is giving me trouble, but I can cope. And the rather unsuspecting individual on the other end was going, oh my goodness, she's having problems with a Cuthbert. So he cabled back, if Cuthbert is giving you trouble, have him eliminated.
Virginia was awarded the MBE, the member of the British Empire, for her courageous efforts, but that wasn't enough for her. She then trained as a radio operator and planned her return to France. She transferred to America's OSS, so if she was killed, her mother would receive death benefits. Then, in November 1943, disguised as an elderly milkmaid, she returned. Virginia was hunted by the Gestapo. They circulated a wanted poster with the warning, "The woman with a limp is one of the most valuable Allied agents in France. We must find and destroy her." But her elaborate disguise fooled the Germans.
To hide her disability, as it were, she learned to walk with a certain gait or swagger that underneath her French milkmaid garb, you didn't really know that this was a woman that had a wooden leg.
In support of D-Day, Virginia radioed invaluable intelligence and coordinated airdrops. She also trained and led Maquis resistance groups in guerrilla warfare and sabotage. After the war, Virginia Hall was awarded America's Distinguished Service Cross in a simple ceremony in William Donovan's office. She refused an elaborate presidential ceremony, saying she was still operational and anxious to get busy. Virginia Hall went on to work for the CIA until her mandatory retirement in 1966. Virginia Hall, Aline Deschamps, Yvonne Cormont, and Barbara Podolsky were the lucky ones. They survived.
The consequences for women agents when caught would be the same as those of male agents. They were subjected on many occasions to dreadful torture. They were held in solitary confinement, starved, beaten, and then for those that were not executed immediately, they could be sent, and many were sent, to the concentration camps of Germany. The costs of their valor and their bravery and volunteering for these sort of services could be quite dreadful.
48 SOE women were sent into France. 12 of them were captured and executed. Brian Stonehouse was also captured. He was convicted of spying. He endured 4 years in Nazi concentration camps. He believes the Germans might even have been harder on the captured women.
4 of our girls were executed in Nassweiler. 4 of our girls were executed in Dachau. And 4 of our girls were executed in Ravensbrück. Now, that's the thing that's always puzzled me, is why were they executed? Why wasn't I executed? And Bob and Tom. And of course, we lived with that fear that every day there'd be the order to or Berlin to execute us, but it never came.
Despite the suffering they all witnessed, the women agents believed their efforts were worth it. But even today, most find it hard to forget the painful memories of that service.
My daughter only yesterday again was telling me, Mother, what are you thinking? Sometimes I'm silent, you know, or I look sad, or details come to my mind. You can't forget that, you know, this is forever